Wache Jules Koostachin Nina Nitisine Kasun. My name is Jules Koostachin. I'm Cree from Ottawa First Nations in Northern Ontario. I'm here at UBC in the PhD program in Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. I've been asked to speak about Indigenous media. So more specifically, I'll be talking about how we can use media to inform on Indigenous issues. So expression and social change. Power exists in our communities. We can work collectively to achieve equity, acknowledgement, and empowerment. Art, or media, is also a means for promoting social change. Art speaks to political, economic, and social issues, bringing to the forefront important dilemmas needing immediate public response. Art is also a means to express our cultural life and a tool to overcome some obstacles. Art as a collective form of expression can challenge colonial systems. So art as resistance can also be a tool to deconstruct the fantasy. As we all know, there's a lot of misrepresentation of Indigenous realities. So media, like I said, can be a tool to deconstruct these constructs. It could be a tool for empowerment, a tool for social change, tool for informing on diverse realities. It also can be a tool as a form of alternative education. So not necessarily being stuck in a classroom within the four walls, but being able to kind of go out there and learn hands-on, learn from watching, learn from cultural activities and so forth. So media is actually a ways we can do that as well. So we can express ourselves and what's happening in our communities through using media as a tool. Media is also a tool for creating a platform for marginalized communities and cultural groups. So it's a way for us to share and also to resist. But I think most importantly, it is also a means to kind of going beyond colonialism and speaking about those traditional realities prior to contact. So my statement here, what I really and truly believe is that our identity informs our practice, our arts practice. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm Cree from Ottawa First Nation in the Mushkegowuk territory. And I was raised by my traditional grandparents, Beth and Abraham, and my mother is a residential school survivor. So I had the opportunity and privilege to live with my grandparents off the land. My grandfather was a hunter and trapper as well as my grandmother. So we spent a lot of our time learning from them, my brothers and I. So that reality and that experience of living off the land with my grandparents in Northern Ontario has really informed my practice and really provided me with the roots to really truly understand, the importance of tradition. My mother is a residential school survivor. She was taken away violently from her family when she was 5 years old and was released at the age of 16. So she spent most of her childhood within the walls of St. Anne's Residential School, the notorious residential school. And that experience of her being a survivor has also impacted me in terms of the work that I choose to do and how I use media to inform on this reality. My grandmother, Beth, because she was such a good hunter and trapper and a provider within the family, they hid her from the Indian agents, so she never actually went to residential school. So I was raised with a survivor residential school, and I was also raised with someone who never went to residential school, but who was impacted in terms of having her daughter taken away from her. Multimedia, content that uses a combination of different forms to tell a story. It can be a combination of text, audio, still images, animation, video, and or interactivity content forms. It can also be a part of a live performance. So telling our stories our way. So Indigenous media can act as a means to dealing with concerns and assist in solving social and political problems. It also sheds light on our realities and from a different perspective than what's already out there, from an Indigenous perspective. It can also work towards solving some of the existing political, social, and environmental injustices, providing an alternative perspective. So, there's social justice films that came in the 60s in response to a lot of environmental and political issues that were arising in our communities and beyond. And also in response to what was happening with the Canadian government. So, storytelling is a natural practice. Traditions are transmitted orally to subsequent generations, ensuring Indigenous histories are not forgotten. It is inevitable that communities will be influenced by advancing and accessible technologies. Unsurprisingly, the desire to gain the skills necessary to share Indigenous accounts and knowledges will be a factor in furthering the development of Indigenous media. So, our stories derive from our families. Our stories derive from our communities. Our stories also derive from our pain, from love, from ceremony. Our stories derive from spirit, and our stories derive from dreams. Sacredness of storytelling. So this is a quote from Louis Bird, The Spirit Lives in the Mind, page 75. To survive, our ancestors acquired special powers, which we call Metewin. They did this through dreaming. It is in dreams that they find answers to a question. Once they begin to seek a deeper knowledge, they could find answers in their dreams. So they would begin to dream quest to allow them to seek answers in dreams. And those who managed to do that became Meteo and passed on their knowledge to the next generation. I really love that quote because it really pays tribute to the spirit world and to the fact that we are informed by our dreams as well. I also believe that media can be a means or a way out of the chaos. So sometimes we experience this chaotic kind of whirlwind of misrepresentation of Indigenous life. But what I believe is that media can also capture really important moments of time. Film and media is also an oral record, which can also be used as an Indigenous archive, an alternative act of preserving our stories and our journeys. So because we're not necessarily speaking our Indigenous languages anymore, media is very similar to oral tradition where you have to listen and you have to pay attention in order to really get the benefits of the narrative that's being shared with you. So you are responsible in learning and responsible in being present and listening. So, I believe that media can also branch out through space and time. So if I create a film now in 2016, and I speak to my mother's reality of being a survivor of residential school, I also believe that that film, that media, will be able to transcend time and space. So possibly 6 generations from now, someone can still access that story and get a little bit of Indigenous history from my family. I incorporated in 2011, and my mandate was to bring change, or is to bring change to each community. I really find it's imperative for me as a director, producer, writer to follow and respect cultural protocols in terms of which communities I approach. And my approach to community is also something that I take very seriously in terms of what I need to be doing in order to access or to talk to someone in that community. And also, it's important to actively listen to stories. So when you are present and someone is really offering a part of themselves or their family or their community to you, I feel that it's super, super important to be present and to actively listen. And also, what's important too is capturing the essence of the stories being shared. So really using the community as a collaborative entity, someone that you're working with to ensure that you are not manipulating or doing harm, and that you are going to be respectful and in terms of that story or that narrative that you're capturing. My first film that I did was a documentary film called Remembering Inini. And it started in 2008. I started my master's program at Ryerson University. And I I was really kind of conflicted in terms of what I wanted to focus on. And at that particular time, my grandmother was not doing so well, and she only speaks Cree. And my mother speaks both English and Cree. So I figured that I would focus on Ininimoan, which translates to the language of the human beings. And it was my first documentary film, basically made with very little money and the support of my children and friends. It was a 2-year process where I ended up capturing a very raw footage in terms of my mourning because my grandmother had passed away very early in 2008. And I was hoping to actually interview my grandmother and capture some of those old stories that she had, because I don't speak Cree and she doesn't speak English. I was really feeling, the pressure of getting that done, and then she passed away. So then the film, Remembering Ininimoan, really went into a different direction where I started to focus on my mother. So it was about the experience of being severed from Ininimoan, the Cree language. Another film that I did was called Nipi. So based on a dream after I read the book from Miguel Ruiz called The Four Agreements. And after I read that book, I was gifted with a very, really insightful dream. And I submitted this script, or this dream that I made into a script, to Imaginative because they were doing a mentorship program with Charles Street Video. And I also included or asked to have the BAMP Center involved. And it was a very difficult process because I wanted to honor the dream, the Metewin that I was given or gifted with. And I wanted to share this in a respectful way. And because there's spiritual beings in this film, I had to be really aware of protocol. And so I asked around different elders and community members in terms of how could I approach these spirit beings that were going to be in my film. So it was a very long process, but it was well worth it, and it's called Napi, which translates to water. Another short film that I did was called Nisu Kakaste Sinawin, which is translated to Two Reflections. And it was a short 8mm film that I did with Female Eye Film Festival. I was a mentor for Indigenous youth, female youth, or those who identified as Isqueo, working with them in terms of bringing their ideas and stories to the screen. So there was an extra footage, and I took a reel of film, and I actually filmed this, and my budget was $35 to get the film actually sent to the lab and digitized it and so forth. So I used poetry as a means to share a very important spiritual experience that I had with my partner and my twin boys. So it's a very short 2-minute film, but I just wanted to, say that it's really important that that as a filmmaker, it doesn't always have to be about money. If you have friends and family and a great idea, that could be a good way to actually, just get together and, make it happen. And there's so many things that you can use now, an iPad, your computer, which I have in front of me, a laptop, your iPhone. Like I've heard award-winning films that were, filmed on iPhones. So I think, now that media is accessible and manageable, we can do a lot, and it doesn't have to cost us a lot of money. A television series is something that I had proposed during my last semester, or my second last semester during my master's at Ryerson University. So I proposed this idea, and it kind of got shot down, and they were like, I don't think anybody's going to go for that. And then actually, I don't take no very well, so I just submitted to APTN, and then I was approved for development. So right now you can actually watch ASCII Boys on APTN. It's actually being aired right now. And what I've done was I used media as a means to survive in a way. So I was a single mother for my 2 older boys who are now going to be, 22 and 20. And I use media to kind of get them reconnected with the land and knowledge keepers and elders. across 13 different Native communities in Ontario and Quebec. Um, so I used media, like I said, to kind of give my kids that little kickstart into their careers and into their futures. Um, and the whole concept behind ASCII Boys was that my grandfather was an Okimau. He was a hunter and trapper, but an Okimau is a leader within a community. And as a leader in that community, my grandfather's responsibility was to ensure that everybody was self-sustaining. So if someone had lost a parent or were not receiving the traditional skills in terms of hunting and trapping, my grandfather would take on that responsibility and take the kids out onto the land. So because he passed away before I could take my boys out, he could take my boys out on the land. I figured that this was an amazing means to get my children that experience. So if you can, watch ASCII Boys. It's a great TV show, and I'm really hoping it'll inspire other Indigenous youth to get out there on the land and reconnect with community. It's an installation where I featured 5 Mushkegowuk territory-based survivors of the Canadian Residential School. The installation focused on the survivors' lives before they were taken away to residential school. So it started with a question. I asked my mother, do you remember your life prior to residential school? Because she was 5 and it was a very traumatizing experience for her. She actually, she responded, she was a bit unclear why I was asking that question, and then she was frustrated because she didn't remember too much prior to residential school. And then about 6 weeks later, my mother called me and she was like, I remember. And then she wrote her journal in terms of all her memories and the smells of, fire, and bannock cooking over an open fire and the rabbit fur blankets and the wigwam. So my mother was like just overwhelmed with memory. And that's what this project was about. So we used photography and we gave every survivor, the 5 survivors, a photo album of collected images when we were up in Northern Ontario. And we accompanied that with their own little space in terms of the installation. So you would approach their site and there would be a life-size poster of the residential school survivor, and there would be an audio, there would be a little MP3 player where you can actually listen to their interview and you can actually sit there and go through their photo album. So it was a great project and a great tribute to, these survivors. Another project that you might find interesting is called Placenta, and that's actually free online. So place is highlighted in Placenta, and it's based on experience. So because I had my twins, I have 9-year-old twins, and I had a Native midwife, and at that particular time they're really fighting for Indigenous women to keep their placentas after birth. So, and because there's ceremony attached to that that placenta. So I documented, I thought, okay, I got a really interesting story here, and I documented the process of trying to figure out what the actual ceremony was for the placenta. Unfortunately, because I move around quite a bit, I haven't done anything with the placenta yet, and it's still frozen in my freezer. So you should, check out that film. It's an interesting short 15-minute documentary. Another thing that I'm working on is called Red Bars, so produced with an Indigenous perspective. So right now, Indigenous women represent 3% of the overall Canadian population, and Indigenous people are about 34% now, even higher, I believe, of the prison population. So we have an epidemic happening here in Canada in terms of incarceration of Indigenous women and men. So I really wanted to kind of, still working on this idea in terms of doing a documentary film about the incarceration of Indigenous women. But I also think it's really important to note that I also wanted to have all Indigenous subjects. So that means Indigenous prison guards, Indigenous subjects in terms of those who have been incarcerated. I wanted it to be fully an Indigenous perspective project. Also, I really worked hard with friends of mine, colleagues, to get a monument put up or installed in Northern Ontario for the late Jules Koostachin. So, we have all these statues across the country in the landscape, with all these European settlers and politicians and so forth. So I thought it was really important that we pay tribute to the work that Jules Koostachin has done in terms of shedding light on education. So that was my latest project, and we actually finished the monument, and it's been installed in New Lisgard in Northern Ontario last fall, 2015, and you can check that out online as well. So, Chimigwech for your time. I hope that you learned a lot. Like I said, media is, I love media. I have fun as a filmmaker. You don't always need a lot of money. Like I said, I made a film with, $35. And, I've used my children. They've come on board to do sound for me, to do camera work and stuff like that, or to be in my films. So I think if you have the passion and you have the stories, and that's the important thing too. If you don't know, what you want to focus on, all of us are carriers of stories. So it could be something as simple, well, maybe not as simple as the placenta, but that was one experience or one thing I was going through at the particular time. And I thought, wow, people might be interested in this. So, self-reflect, think about the things that are going on in your life and what makes you tick. And maybe, there's a story there. So, Chimigwech.